Okay, I think we can start. Welcome everyone to our first keynote. I'm Annalena Caputo, Assistant Professor in the School of Computing in Dublin City University, and I will be chairing this session. Please use Discord or the chat box in Zoom to leave your questions for the Q&As. I'm very pleased today to introduce you this talk, which looks at how we can reconstruct what has been lost by using technology and recreate a virtual reimagining of the Record Treasury of the Public Record Office of Ireland, lost in 1922. Our speakers today are Professor Peter Crooks. Professor Crooks, he's an associate professor in medieval history at Trinity College Dublin in Ireland, and he's also the director of Beyond 2022, Ireland's virtual record treasury, an all-Ireland and international collaboration to create a virtual reality reconstruction of the Public Record Office of Ireland and its collections, which were destroyed at the outbreak of the Irish Civil War in 1922. He is also the academic coordinator of the Trinity Long Room Hub's multi-annual lecture series entitled Out of the Ashes, Collective Memory, Cultural Loss and Recovery. And the second speaker, Dr. Gary Monally, who is the technical lead of Beyond 2022. He has completed his PhD in computer science in 2019 under the supervision of Professor Seamus Lawless, working on modeling and structuring cultural heritage information. Within Beyond 2022, he is focused on developing tools and methods to support historians in reconstructing his archive. In addition to this, Gary is also involved in Provenance, an EU-funded project which aims to identify and label instances of fake news online. So without further ado, I leave you the floor to Peter and Gary, who will present Towards an Archive of the Future, Reconstructing Ireland's Lost History through the Beyond 2022 project.
Thank you very much, Annalena, and my thanks also to Owen Conlon for the invitation to speak to you today. As Annalena says, I'm a historian, so it's a particular honor for me to speak to you at Hypertext. Gary Monally, my colleague, will be dealing with some of the technology, but this is a deep collaboration between the humanities and historians and archivists with computer science, and I hope we can bring to you something of that application of the technologies and what it can do for reconstructing Ireland's lost memories. I'm going to try and share my screen now. Hopefully that's sharing with you.
Yes.
Make it bigger, and like that should be full screen now. Is that right, Annalena?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So this is a project about recovering a lost national treasure, which is our National Archives of Ireland, which was destroyed in 1922, nearly a century ago next year. What I want to do is offer some historical context for that and give a sense of some of the applications of the technologies before Gary in the second half of the talk looks in depth at some of the way we're connecting our data and making it accessible. Our story is about recovering memory, but in a global context, the destruction of memory continues to be a major theme. And in 1996, UNESCO published a report on this. It was after the Balkans conflicts. It was called Lost Memory. It documents in extraordinary detail the number of archives, libraries, museums, and other cultural heritage institutions that were destroyed only in the 20th century. And they leave this very bleak message, which is that archives are irreplaceable, any loss is final, and reconstruction is impossible. And in a sense, what our project is trying to do is not refute that absolutely. It's true that one of the things about archives in an absolute sense is that they are unique, but we are looking at how it is possible to reconstruct through bringing together copies, transcriptions, and other resources, as well as bringing it together in a reimagined space of what has been lost to create an entirely new experience. Archives are always about the future. Our title, Archive of the Future, Towards an Archive of the Future, in that sense is a little misleading. Archives have always been about protecting something for the future. The disgusting image before you is a rat that was found in skeletal form in archives in the 1830s, at the moment when the first really modern archives were being created. The movement for modern archival repositories, preserving historical records for future generations, really begins only in the early 19th century after the French Revolution. The Archives Nationales in France was the first, and the British National Archives was established in the aftermath of that. And this rat I bring to your attention because it was presented before the House of Commons in the 1830s as an example of what would happen if they didn't do something about their archives, if they didn't start protecting them. This particular rat was found having munched its way through some parchment records, and it died enclosed in the parchment. And you can see this report on the screen there from the House of Commons, where it says the archives are being searched by a dog for rats, and Irish labourers, sustained by strong stimulants, are sorting out a mass of putrid filth, stench, dirt, and decomposition. This was the state of the archives of the United Kingdom in the 1830s. And in 1838, they established the first national level archive in the UK, what is now the National Archives UK, what was then the Public Record Office in London. And 30 years later in Ireland, because Ireland was then part of the United Kingdom, a similar office opened in the 1860s on the Liffey near the Four Courts, as part of the Four Courts complex on the north side of the river. This is it. This is one of the very few photographs we have of it from 1914. It's Ireland's new public record office. And really it was the archive of the future as it was imagined in the 1860s. It opens in 1867, a brand new purpose-built repository. If you look at the shape of the building, it tells us something about the story of what happens in the moment of the loss of the archive in 1922. This section here to the back with the arcade of windows is the repository. And this section here, there's another granite block to the front. That is the office block and the reading room. And between the two, there is a fire gap. A false wall separates them so that fire couldn't spread from the one to the other. I'll explain how that goes wrong in a few minutes. These are the architectural drawings showing what this building, which was wonderfully known as the Record Treasury, because it contained a treasury of national archives going back nearly 7 centuries. It was conceived as a state-of-the-art building in the 1860s. And in a way, what I'm pointing out is I'm sort of riffing off the fact that many of the things that interest digital humanities scholars and computer scientists today about how do we preserve, how do we connect, how do we link information was being dealt with in the 1860s in a physical and analog format. They were dealing here with storage, and they also had to deal with access and discoverability. They enabled discovery by having an on-site search room, by creating thousands of pages of indexes through which they interlinked their information. And by 1914, that entire repository was full on the outbreak of the Great War. And they were beginning major publications projects to make the public more aware of what they had in that building. It was described in that year as the great untilled field of Irish history. For the first time, centuries of material had been brought together, but it was untilled in the sense that it hadn't yet been fully discovered. They were also concerned about its safety. They laid on an extra water supply to the building in case there was a fire. They had the fire safety break that I described between this room and the room that held the records behind it. That was intended to prevent a fire that might start with the heating system in this reading room spreading into the repository behind. And they had, I think it was 6 fire extinguishers, which they said would be more than enough should a fire break out to repress any flames. Well, as it turned out, 6 fire extinguishers was not sufficient. What you're looking at here is the unique photograph we have of the interior of the Record Treasury, the repository building in about 1914. You can see arcades of windows and then top lit from above so that the records wouldn't be damaged by light. And the men who are hanging off the galleries around the edges are the archivists and the searchers who would go and retrieve records and bring them to the reading room. So you've got a huge building there full of material. And this is the same building after the fire of 1922. You can see the ironwork galleries have literally melted in the heat. And this fire happens in the opening moments of Ireland's Civil War in June 1922. Ireland has just separated as an independent free state from the United Kingdom, and a conflict breaks out between those who are in favour of the agreement under which Ireland became independent and those who are against it. And on the third day of a siege of the forecourts in the city centre of Dublin, this building goes on fire, and the result is the complete calamitous loss of the records that are in the building. 7 centuries of material are completely destroyed. This is the famous dome of the forecourts in Dublin, which if you know the city, you'll recognise. And you can see the surrounding buildings on fire on June 30th, 1922. And here, an exterior shot of the same complex of buildings, but now showing the Record Treasury that I was talking about, with the ironwork galleries completely melted and destroyed, so that the records tumbled into the heat and fire below. The report afterwards says, the fire left little but tangled ironwork, blocks of masonry, and the charred fragments and ashes of what had once been public records. And indeed, some of those charred fragments have come through the fire, and we're trying to do conservation on them at present. By an amazing coincidence, it was Winston Churchill who was standing in the House of Commons that day, that very day, the 30th of June, 1922. And when he was told that the Public Record Office was on fire, he understood entirely the significance of it. But he said in an off-the-cuff remark, "A state without archives is better than archives without a state." Well, our work is trying to imagine an archive that is in a sense stateless. It's a reimagined, reconstructed virtual archive, which draws upon a deep collaboration now between institutions who have never before this project worked together. The British National Archives, the National Archives UK, our National Archives, which is the successor institution to the one that was destroyed in 1922, and the Public Record Office Northern Ireland, the institution in Belfast that was founded after partition. And all of these archives have significant quantities of material that can replace what was lost in 1922. I'm now going to stop sharing that for a moment and try and share a video with you that gives you a sense of what we're trying to bring back together in terms of the virtual reality. Hopefully this will now play for you.
Dublin, June 30th, 1922. Day 3 of the Battle of the Four Courts, the opening engagement of the Irish Civil War. Shortly after noon, the city is shaken by a huge explosion. After the blast, fire takes hold and plumes of white smoke are seen billowing from an arcade of tall windows in a corner of the Four Courts complex. This is the Record Treasury of Ireland's Public Record Office. Irish history, dating back over 700 years, is on fire. Inside the Record Treasury, the intense heat melts the high ironwork galleries and shelving, casting paper and parchment records into the flames below. Miraculously, one part of the building survives almost intact, except for a blast hole in the side wall. The Record House, and at its heart, the handsome search room where researchers pored over historical documents, had escaped the worst of the damage. Now supported by the Government of Ireland, the Beyond 2022 project is reconstructing the search room in virtual reality. Here, readers in 1922 conducted their research beneath the natural light of a beautiful glazed ceiling. And for the first time in a century, we can reopen the double doors that led to the Record Treasury, passing through the fire break which stopped the blaze spreading to the front of the building. On the centenary of the fire, 4 steps will take you on your journey through Ireland's virtual record treasury. Explore, locate, connect, discover. Entering through the Record House, you can admire its elegant staircase before passing into the search room where your discoveries begin. From here, you can search the archive and travel to the very place in the lofty galleries of the Treasury where the records destroyed in 1922 have been reassembled from surviving copies and transcripts located in archives across Ireland and around the world. Now, next-generation technology enables you to visualize the whole archive and make connections in ways that were unimaginable a century ago. Returning to the search room, you can discover more about the people, places, and topics contained in the documents. Beyond 2022, unlocking the story of Ireland and its peoples across 7 centuries, and reopening a lost archive to new generations with new questions.
I should be sharing again my my PowerPoint, hopefully. I'll just enlarge it again. So that should give you a sense of the user experience that we're trying to develop to inspire a whole new generation of researchers, not just historians, but members of the general public who have a vested interest in this history that has been lost and that we can recreate. When I'm talking to historical or archival or cultural heritage audience, I tend to emphasize scale, scope, and significance to convey what's involved in the project in terms of its reconstruction component. Scale in terms of the number of archives with whom we're working and the scale of the content. It's over 50 archives and libraries at present, and it will grow worldwide. And the content is at least 50 million words of searchable text in the reconstructed archives. The scope extends right back to the 12th century. The earliest document we have is 1174. It's immediately after Ireland becomes a dominion of the English crown in the Middle Ages. And the significance, this is a national legacy project now from Ireland's commemorative decade, the decade of centenaries. And we have a real potential, if we imagine this the right way, to connect with Irish populations all over the world on all those interested in Irish history. But from a technical perspective, there's 3 other strands that I would emphasize, 3 layers in a way that we have to plan for to make this reconstructed archive really work. The first is information, then knowledge, and then discovery. And really here, I'm just teeing up what Gary Munnelly will talk to you about in much more detail. In terms of information, one of our first jobs was to reconstruct in a way that was maintained its integrity, the catalogue or collection that was in the Public Record Office of Ireland in 1922. And in that, we were fortunate to have a catalogue published in 1919 called A Guide to the Records of the Public Record Office, which listed out in detail the records that were destroyed. And here, the key thing is that we were respecting a hierarchy. They didn't have archival standards that were accepted internationally in 1919, but they did try and describe their own collection in an accurate and robust hierarchical way. And we respect that hierarchy, and we've turned it into a database. And that principle in archival science of respect des fonds in French, goes right back to the French Revolution and the first modern archival repositories. In our Beyond 2022, we respect not only the hierarchy of the record office that was destroyed, but also all the other hierarchies of all the other archives with whom we work and with whom we interlinked replacement records with records that were destroyed in the fire. So that's the first information management challenge, was that of respecting hierarchies and interlinking data. The second to do with information is how complex and difficult and messy the historical data is. Going back 7 centuries, we're dealing with different languages, Latin, Old French, Old English, texts in difficult handwritings, often abbreviated. And so we have to find a way to bring that very complex historical content into a way that it can be discovered. And here I think the layer that's based on linked data, the knowledge layer, has been absolutely groundbreaking. It's certainly the thing that in my understanding of the potential for technologies and cultural heritage that has been the biggest shift in my own mindset. We're creating a knowledge graph for Irish history. At the moment, it's prioritizing person and place and institutions, but the potential here for a really powerful tool that can structure our knowledge about Ireland, the concepts underlying Irish history, and so on, I think is really powerful, not just for this reconstructed archive, but for cultural heritage more generally. There's a really powerful lesson for historians here that we don't have to be right. We can structure the knowledge in a way that we can interlink our information without imposing our meanings on other historians. I think that's going to be very powerful as we see it develop. And the third component is discovery. Gary will tell you much more about the discovery layer in terms of the search, the information retrieval, and the other facilities we have. But we're also using virtual reality and Web 3D technologies to inspire a new form of engagement with the destroyed archive. Here, I think this is really exciting because what we're doing in a sense is reconnecting audiences with the way the record office of in the year of the fire was itself imagined. And I'm going to share one last time with you a slide before I pass to Gary, which is a prototype that we made in June this year for the 99th anniversary of the fire, which we were calling the Dollhouse, because what you're looking at is the Record Treasury building, that repository building, split open on its axis and showing a cross section of the bays or compartments that held the records in 1922. We know the locations of the records, we know what was there, and in many cases we can replace what was lost. And this Web 3D interface lets the user explore just as they imagined the records in the 1919 catalog within this repository architecture. This example is Bay 1C, it's floor 1, level C. We can see the records that it held in 1919. It was the Auditor General's Office, the Surveyor General's Office. Ireland was probably the most intensively surveyed and mapped country in the world from the 17th century onwards. And many of these maps were held in the office and survive in duplicate format. So we have managed to scan and reconnect the lost map collections with this section of the record office, and the user can explore this material using all the rich data and metadata that is being drawn directly from the database. So this gives you a hint of, I think, both the richness in content, but also the richness of the experience that we're trying to create here. Okay, with that, I'll hand across to Gary, and having told you a little bit about what we're trying to do, Gary is going to explain how we are trying to do it. Thanks, Gary.
Thanks very much, Peter. It's kind of the problem with doing a talk with Peter is he's really good. He's a tough act to follow. So I'll try and be as interesting as he is. So the focus for me is to, as Peter said, talk about some of the more technical aspects of the project. Peter has a really nice phrase, which is building the archive of the future. And success in that endeavor, can be measured in several different ways. Obviously, the reconstruction of the lost public records office will be a triumph, but what I want to show is how we're going about achieving it and what standards and technologies we're using in order to ensure the openness, accessibility, and reusability of the data that we generate. At the end of the day, this isn't just data, this is a nation's history, and it should be available to the people of Ireland in as many ways as we can offer. So this is a talk which is going to unfold in two parts, and it's really going to try and address two questions, very simple questions. What data do we have, and what technologies are we using to model it so we can achieve these goals of openness and accessibility? And how are we personally leveraging this data within the project to provide a multimodal experience? It's worth mentioning at this early point that anything we're doing with the data, you can do it too, right? It's all exposed over APIs. 2022 is huge. It has many different moving parts and can make it quite difficult to focus a talk on the technical aspects. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make use of this architecture diagram, which essentially sets out the entire Beyond 2022 data treatment pipeline. In order to address what data we have and how we're structuring it, we're just going to look at parts 1 and 2, this bit up the top and this bit down the bottom. We're going to skip over part 3, not because it's boring, but because time is limited. And I think of the things in this diagram, that's one piece that we can just gloss over for now. And part 4 over here, although it's the smallest part of the diagram, I think this is where an awful lot of the fun happens. There are essentially 2 keystones which form the foundations of Beyond 2022. And the first one that I'll mention is the Beyond 2022 database. That's represented here at the bottom of the diagram. This is where all the actual reconstruction of the virtual archive happens. This is a relational database which curates metadata about documents and how they relate to each other. So what you can see here is our team of historians on the left working away, researching, identifying sources that we can use to recover our lost PROI. Their discoveries are curated in one of several ways, 2 of which are represented on this diagram. The one on the top, the CSV file, is the most common curation method that we use. Within the team, we have a series of spreadsheet templates which are distributed to historians and archivists. And as they discover new material, they fill out the spreadsheet. And when they're done, they upload the spreadsheet to our team website. And that website structures the information and stores it for us in the database. Now, the specific metadata fields that we capture for an item are largely guided by an archival standard called ICIT-G. This is pretty much just a guide for what information you should try to capture about a document if you're housing it in an archive. It defines 7 areas of description, and these areas of description in turn are made up of about 26 different elements. These elements range from the very obvious: a document should have a title, a document should have a reference code which can uniquely identify it, but also on to some perhaps less obvious stuff, things like access rights, the language of the material, scope and content, extent and medium. If you're interested in this, you can download the ICIT-G standard and read it for yourself. It's freely available on the internet. But one of the nice things that ICIT-G gives us is a hierarchical model of documents. So to keep it reasonably simple, if we just look at the file level down here, if you think of a book as a file, a book is made up of a series of chapters. Each of those chapters would be items. So there's this parent-child relationship between a book and its chapters. If a book is published as part of a series, well, you have a series of documents, and whoever produced that series is the FONS. Now, FONS could be a government body, for example. So you might have the Department of Agriculture, who releases annual reports which go into series. This is really handy for us. This is actually a major feature of our data model because what we can do here is we can break our archive contents down into, metaphorically, atoms, and then reconstitute them in the form of something that was lost. So we can take an item from one place and we can stitch it to a series that was destroyed somewhere else. And stitch is a bit of an internal term that we use. It essentially means that we are creating a link between something we've found and something we've lost. So this link carries metadata. It might be, we found something that's a perfect substitute for something that was destroyed in the fire. It was duplicated, handwritten, brilliant. Or it could just be, we have found a passing reference to this document that would have been on this shelf. And that's kind of a sad situation, but at least we know what was there. I mentioned a few alternative methods of getting data into the database, and just because it's here on the diagram, I'm going to mention Transcribus, but we're actually also compatible with Zotero, and we're currently working on integrating with a few other means of curating information. Transcribus is brilliant. If you haven't heard of it, check it out. It is a handwriting recognition tool which lets us upload image scans of documents, and it analyzes the images and sends us back extremely high quality transcriptions in TEI XML format. Now, Peter showed you a screenshot of one of the manuscripts that we deal with. I think you can see what a challenge it is to automatically extract text from that, but Transcribus seems to do it. So these transcriptions and the corresponding images also actually get funneled up into the database. So within the database, we have transcriptions, reconstruction information, and references to images. So if we now, actually, before we move on, there is a REST API that sits in front of that database, which gives you CRUD operations over it. I mentioned this just to point to one thing. If you make a request to the REST API, you, of course, get the data that's relevant to your request. In this case, I asked for a document 69983, but we're also using HaitiOS in this project. So in addition to getting the thing you asked for, the REST API will also push links to other things that are potentially of interest to you. In this case, the REST API is telling you, if you want to render this document, the historians have requested that you use this title. You'll find it at this link. And this particular item has an ICG content of access and use area. So the REST API is actively trying to help you to discover new parts of itself that you might not be aware exist. And this is obviously great for discoverability, but if it's done well, it's also fantastic for responsive, automatically updating user interfaces. So now returning to the whole diagram, the second keystone, which makes up our data layer, is represented along the top of this architecture diagram. And that's the Beyond 2022 knowledge graph. Whereas the database is concerned with storing information about documents, the knowledge graph stores information about the entities that documents contain. These are people, places, organizations, etc. And this is actually a rather challenging problem. First of all, because being definitive about anything in history is extremely hard to do. There's no one correct way to write history, and we need to acknowledge that. And the other challenge is it can actually be really hard to pin down exactly what should constitute an entity. And I'll come back to that point a little later. But before I go any further, I have to say a huge thank you to Dr. Christophe de Brun, Dr. Fabrizio Orlandi, and Dr. Lynn Kilgallen, who have really been the driving force behind this part of the project and have done amazing work turning it into a very useful research tool. This is one of the cool pieces of the project to watch as it evolved. So the core of our process for ingesting data into the knowledge graph is very similar to that of the database. Our historians curate information about entities in a series of prescribed spreadsheets. So in this case, this is actually an example that was done by Dr. Lynn Kilgallen. She was looking at Irish Exchequer payments, and from these she extracted lists of people that she wanted to document in the knowledge graph. She captures things like varied spellings of their name, their gender, relationships that they have with other people in the knowledge graph, so the mother, the father, and offices that they would have held. We uplift this to a linked data representation using OR to ORML. What we get out the other side is our Beyond 2022 knowledge graph. And this is extremely powerful because we can now explore relationships between entities in ways that were previously challenging, if not impossible to do. So Peter showed this image during his talk, and I want to revisit it because this was one of the things we did where it was just brilliant. We can use a Sparkle query here to determine all people who held the office of, say, the Chancellor of Ireland. So we have the Chancellors of Ireland office down here. We have the Treasurer of Ireland's office over here. And we can identify people who held both of these offices at some point in their career. And we can see which of these people also held the role of the Chief Governors of Ireland. So you can, with this graph, you can start to map the careers that people would have had. You know, I'm just going to say the 15th century because I see Balscott there dying in 1400. And furthermore, you could do things, you can model things like families as well. You can group these entities into families. You could show how maybe certain offices stayed within certain families. That's really, really exciting. I also mentioned a bespoke Beyond 2022 ontology here. This is actually built on top of the CDOC CRM ontology. If you've heard of it, it was originally conceived of for modeling artifacts that were discovered during archaeological digs as they came out of the ground. It's extremely abstract and generic. You can pull bits of it together to say almost anything you could possibly want about a historical event, entity, whatever. So the consequence of this is that our knowledge graph is quite verbose, but it also means that we can capture a lot of the complexities inherent in historical research. And Peter mentioned, you know, the word respect. That's really what it's about. It's about respecting the history and trying to model it as accurately as we can. In some places, that's messy. An example of this, which I like, is this one here, where we were modeling a place. And what this is basically telling you is there is a place which at some point went by the name Ballyhagan, and Ballyhagan that ended in an E. But you can't just say that, because names don't belong to places forever. Place names change. So in this case, Ballyhagan and Ballyhagan, the two different spellings, are actually entities. They are first-class citizens within the knowledge graph, and they have been given class appellation. So we have two appellation entities, which by themselves just represent strings, which are names. We then have two assignment events here. One is a blank node, and one is 6332 Ballyhagan. And these denote the point in time at which each of these appellations was taken to refer to this abstract concept of a place, Ballyhagan. And Ballyhagan, the concept of a place at various times, will also have geographic coordinates associated with it. It may at some point have been a town, but then that town was split. So the concept of the place Ballyhagan remains, but the area that it takes up is different. The great thing about this is we can attach information to these assignment events. We can say when they happened, when they terminated, who did it, and in this case down here, how we know about it. Here's the image where we found this piece of information. This is the source that told us at some point this spelling could be a reference to this place. That's pretty cool. So all of this is curated in a Blaze Graph triple store, and obviously this exposes a Sparkle endpoint. So in addition to the REST API for the database, we have a Sparkle endpoint for the triple store. And I'll point it out in the architecture diagram here too. The triple store will cite metadata from the database, so we can get from the triple store to the database via citations. We're actually going to implement the inverse of this as well, so the database will point back. But the nice thing about this property is we don't have to link back to our database. We can actually link out to other authoritative sources, such as the Dictionary of Irish Biography and the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. Something which isn't visually represented on the architecture diagram, but which I really ought to mention, is TripleIF. TripleIF is basically a set of specifications which are used to control access and presentation of image-based content via REST. It's expressed using JSON. Anything we do which has anything to do with a visual representation of an object, whether it's presenting sequences of images or just putting an image on a page, there's a really good chance we've done that through TripleIF. The reason why I'm sort of mentioning it here is because it's a little bit hard to place this within the project. It's very tightly integrated with the database, but it's a separate entity. It does store data. Not all of that data is derived from the database's contents. So it's not really a keystone like the database and the knowledge graph are, but it's extremely important. And it is a service that you can call on. So back when we started, there were 4 major specifications that TripleIF defined. They've since expanded on that. Of these 4 original ones, we're using 3. The image API allows you to send a HTTP request to a server for an image. Within the URL, you specify transformations that you want to apply to that image. Crop it, rotate it, skew it, change the format, change the color encoding. And on the back end, on the server, the image undergoes those transformations, and then it is then served back to you. The presentation API describes how we stitch these images together in order to form a coherent, readable document that you can leaf through. The search API is pretty self-explanatory. It is, if you want to provide search over a TripleIF document, here's how you implement it, and here's how you should respond to requests. It's important to note that TripleIF is only a specification, and it's up to other people to implement it. So you have to go out and find TripleIF compliant tools. For the TripleIF image API, we're using LoRa server, which is basically just a Python wrapper around ImageMagick. For the presentation API and the search API, we've actually implemented our own versions of those. So just trucking on with the presentation API, because this has a couple of really interesting qualities. First of all, this is the logical structure of a TripleIF manifest. A manifest is a document, and it's comprised of sequences of images. Those images are drawn on top of canvases, and we can have annotations on top of those canvases as well. So we can embed our transcription layer within our image presentation layer, And with a suitable front end, all of that gets rendered together. Another kind of cool thing that we can do is we can define ranges over these canvases. This is essentially like defining a table of contents. So it just makes it really easy for the user to interact with these documents once they're served. And the end result, I personally think, is pretty attractive. I'll show you a screenshot now in a second. This is what a manifest looks like in practice. It's a big JSON document. I don't want you to interpret this. I just want you to note something really interesting. The bits that I've put a red box around, they're dereferenceable URIs. Every piece of a TripleF manifest gets a unique dereferenceable URI, and that means that you can cite every piece of a TripleF manifest. Here is the call to the image API, which gives me back what this page will look like. In this case, I'm saying, give me the full image. Don't transform it in any way in terms of skewing or cropping. Don't rotate it. Give me the default color scheme and give it to me as a JPEG. And that is embedded within a Canvas 303 Canvas P1. I can also store these links back to annotations and transcriptions on top of these documents. Now, we're not doing this within Beyond 2022, but every time I point to this, I kind of say, think about the potential here for citing within your knowledge graph. I've already said we can cite out to metadata, but with this, we can cite to specific regions of images. TripleF is by far and away one of the things I've had the most fun with on this project. And when you drop it into a suitable viewer like Mirador, which you're looking at here, it looks good. This is a lovely high resolution image of a document we got from the Royal Irish Academy. Down the side here, you can see those ranges. So someone took the time to put together a table of contents for this. And if we do a search over it, within the return results, it's possible, if I click on that, it brings me to the specific instance of the word on the page. That's wonderful from a user interface perspective. And it's just a thing that TripleF does. So I think with that, I've covered everything that I need to say about how we model our data and how we structure our data. I'm conscious of the fact that I have about 3 minutes left, so I'm going to go through the next section pretty quickly. But I do want to talk a little bit about this piece over here, the Beyond 2022 portal. How are we using the data? And the real thing that I want to drive home here is that we have invested a lot of time and effort in structuring this data so that you can chop it up, change it, and use it however you want. Here are some of the ways that we did it within the project. And some of this is going to be end user facing, some of it's internal tools that we use for ourselves. But if you wanted to build these things yourself, you could. It all happens through APIs over the web. So some of the things we're building, we have intelligent entity-based search, which I'll get into. Peter talked about our immersive 3D environment. We also have a digital personal assistant, which in the long run, we're hoping will be able to pull on information in the database and the knowledge graph and start to help you by describing answers to queries that you have back to you. We have a knowledge graph exploration tool, which is currently in the pipeline. So because the knowledge graph is quite complex, it would be nice if there was a tool that could condense that down into its core entities, the core entities that 90% of people care about. And then you sort of have information cards which condense the rest of that information. Did you know this name only applied to this place for so long? And we have some traditional web-based exploration and internal editing tools for our own purposes. I'm not going to go through another architecture diagram, I promise. I'm sorry this is here, but what I want to show you, this is an architecture diagram that was put together by Dr. Vuong Ngo, who is our information retrieval expert. This is not a completely new diagram. The architecture diagram that we have focused on for this talk basically ends here at the knowledge graph and KWNE nodes. So there's a line here. And what Vuong has done is he has tacked his own search indexing process on top of this to produce the kind of search that he wants over these documents. Now, the search that Vuong is implementing for us is entity driven. The idea being, if you're searching for a person in a large corpus of text, and we have at the moment tens of thousands of documents, that will go up to hundreds of thousands of documents, and we have millions and millions and millions of words. Wouldn't it be great if I did a search for Granny Monolith and the search engine knew who I was talking about and could do a specific search for that person for me? So this is what Vuong is looking at for us. So here we have kind of an example of a more traditional keyword search. He does a search for Ferguson James. We get back a list of results. And this is great. This is, sort of what we've come to expect from search engines. But what Vuong can do is he can specify, actually, I want Ferguson James, a person, and he can add more detail onto that query as is necessary. And he drills down into the Ferguson James who is of interest to him specifically. And he can bring us to the page that person occurs on as well, which is a lovely feature. We can open on the page, we can see the transcription here. I will mention, Vuong is not building a user interface for us. So it's a bit of a dump, a dump of information is what I meant to say. But this is potentially really powerful. So we're quite excited about the future of this search engine. We want to make it not just aware of the entity that you've searched for, but also how the contents that you've retrieved sort of break down on an entity level. So these are the documents that discuss these offices. These are the documents that discuss these locations in Ireland. We also want to add an NLP layer on top of it, if possible, so that we don't have to do this construction of the query. We can actually parse what someone is saying and try and turn that into a well-structured query. It's a hard problem, but we'll see how that goes. This is a more traditional, boring search that I wrote way back. And it's just a different interpretation of the same data, where Vuong is pulling on both the knowledge graph and the database to do this really interesting search. I just pulled on the database and did a traditional Solr search engine. Those images are all served through TripleF. The data is all coming from the database. I mentioned our internal editing tool. So this is a screenshot of the data capture interface. Again, all running on top of the same APIs. In this case, I've generated some summary statistics. This is how much stuff was in the database when I took the screenshot. It was really disappointing. It shows 360 items added in the last 7 days. The day before, there were a couple of thousand items there, and we just rolled over the date line. I took the screenshot on the wrong day. This is a subtly cool diagram, which shows the breakdown of items by century, the century of their contents. Why is this cool? It's cool because dates are fuzzy. It's really hard to represent time in a computer. If you only know that a person sort of existed in a particular century, or if a document was written sometime between the 1st of March and the 32nd of September, 32nd of September, 1st of September. How do you represent that? How do you provide normalized search over it? What if you wanted to change calendar? The Gregorian calendar or the Julian calendar isn't good enough for you. You want to use the Regnal calendar. We've come up with a way of actually normalizing all of those dates. And so far it's handled all of the cases we've come up against. So that's a really, that little diagram, although it doesn't look like much, is a huge win for me, because it's normalized search over a variety of different calendars and summarization of what we have in the database. Here is the actual hierarchy of the database. So you can see the Public Records Office of Ireland, FONs, sub-FONs, and here are some series that are in the Court of Chancery in the Public Records Office. And if I click on one of these, it's just another query to the REST API. Here's all the metadata about it. One of my really cool winning dates. You can see where it sits in a hierarchy. Yeah, so this is sort of the more traditional look at this data. If we get into something kind of cooler, this is the image that I had up at the start. And that's because this is one of my favorite images from the project. This is an interactive demo. This is online. You can go and walk around this room, click on hotspots and get information. This is the kind of environment that we're hoping to drop the virtual assistant into. The idea is that you would be able to walk up to a shelf where there might be a specific hotspot where you issue a query, and the virtual assistant will give you a history lesson about something that you're looking at. And at some point in the future, that will be based on the information in our knowledge graph and database. One of the big winners for me in this image is this book here at the bottom. That's Wood's Guide, digitized, open, and interactive within the virtual model, all coming through the APIs. You can flick through that and read it. I really like this image. Back at the start of the project, the idea that you pop on a VR headset and you'd sort of through an Oculus Rift, you'd walk around and explore the building. But with COVID, you know, we sort of have to be more, should we say, hygiene conscious. And that's where we sort of move to models like the Dollhouse, which don't have to be enjoyed through a VR experience. Peter's already demoed this for you, but again, this was a massive triumph for the project, I think, because it just demonstrates how we can chop our data up and present it in any one of a huge number of ways. So how do we keep the data open and accessible? We use well-established open standards to model and share the data. ICIG for archival standards, TripleF has been brilliant. CDOC-CRM is great for modeling the messiness of historical data, 3JS for anything 3D that we're putting online, and TEI-XML for transcriptions. We have deviated from that rule in places, but not very often. Deviations are sort of on a case-by-case basis. There's only 2. I'm a firm advocate for expose your data over the web. REST, Sparkle, enable the machine to interpret your data and help the computer to find related materials, because that way you can build more interesting user experiences on top of them. I'm a strong believer in the openness of data. What can we do with the data? Whatever we want. And that's kind of nice to be able to say. Our biggest limiting factor so far has not been how we want to chop up our data and present it. Our biggest limiting factor has been time and resources. We have some ideas in the pipeline, some nice to have, some things we'd love to do, which aren't necessarily something that will get done by the time this project ends, but which are completely feasible with the approach that we've taken to this reconstruction. And that's really exciting. And yeah, I'll end there. 1 minute-ish over time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter and Gary, for giving us this insightful view on this project and its challenges. So please feel free to use the chat box in Zoom to write down your questions. I will start with one question. I think you mentioned before, Gary, something about copyright and this idea of stitching together content that is either available inside, the archive, but also with other archives outside Ireland. How does it work with the problem of copyright and property of these collections?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So what we've had to do is we have built access controls into the database, where if we need to I suppose, not make an item available over our public APIs, we can switch them off. It's a really sad thing to have to do for me personally. But we have, through ICIG, a field where we can monitor what licenses different items are available under. And we can come up with appropriate ways to present them to the end user based on that. But it's a little binary. It's sort of, you can either see the item or you can't.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. There is a question from Brendan. Well, first of all, great talk. And are you talking to other countries about how you did this? Countries that might have also lost archives or want to digitize theirs?
Peter, I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, well, it is an international project with a lot of international archival partners. And just to pick up on what Gary was saying about the copyright issue, the whole ethos of the project is open. So that any materials that are shared with us are then through some, it's either Creative Commons or local government license or whatever. But he's right that we can have materials and then specify the license. ICIG supports that. In terms of the reconstruction component, we ran a lecture series for 3 years that you mentioned out of the ashes that was trying to set what we're doing in that wider context. It did generate a lot of interesting parallelisms and discussions, and I think there's room for not just in the archival world but also in museums where materials have been lost, for looking at the models that Gary and colleagues in Adaptive put together for trying to respect the integrity of what has been lost versus what has been discovered. I think that's going to be very powerful. So the conversations are there. I think it'll be interesting in the years after the centenary next year when the whole thing is live to see kind of be specifically applied to another case study. That would be very exciting to see. To date, most archives that I've seen do this have tended to be still in the analog world.
Okay, I see Owen, you have raised your hand, please.
Thanks, Annalena. Gary, Peter, thanks for a really interesting talk. So the theme of this year's conference is around multimodality. And I think your project, epitomizes that. Can you talk a little bit, maybe Peter, first, the importance of modalities? So having the knowledge graph and text and the image, because I think the TripleIF as a technology really shows the connectedness of text as a computer would understand it versus text as it manifests in a manuscript that may be handwritten or laid out in a certain way. Can you talk a little bit around the interrogation aspects that this multimodality brings?
I think this is going to take a little while to percolate into the historical research community, but the thing that's really becoming apparent is the totally democratizing effect this has. It had been the case for decades that historians were the specialists who knew where the keys to the archives were and where to find things. And this whole process is going to completely open up access to archival materials in a way that is going to break down those specialist boundaries. And I think it's going to be very exciting to watch the point at which you no longer are referencing a published book version of the manuscript. We're going to be able to very soon to be robust enough in historical scholarship to drop in a TripleIF reference or equivalent into the footnote and take you directly to a persistent identifier of the manuscript. So the connection between interpreter and the source document is going to be really intimate in a way that hasn't been previously. There have always been these layers of interpretation or mediation between the document and the source. So I think that kind of access, I think at an educational level too, for researchers getting back in touch with the contents of the materials, that's a total shift in the last 10 years. And we're seeing it move forward here again in a different way. So that's very exciting. And I think the knowledge graph piece, understanding that you can model information and we can model it our way and we can interlink with somebody else's model and we don't have to impose one authority. There's always this great fear in history that you impose an authority, you'll distort or create conflict in interpretation. I think that's going to be very exciting to see how that develops and becomes much more widely understood as a useful way of modeling our knowledge of the past.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think just to bring in a word that you see in this community quite a lot is the word narrative. And it allows for a suite of different narratives to be created, argued over materials. And then because of that robustness of linking right back to the source, you can kind of really interrogate the different narratives people are exposing around material. And there's no one great narrative. And I think that's the positive of all of this, but it allows people to see where they intersect and agree. And I think it's very powerful. So thank you.
Thanks, Owen.
Thank you. I think Mark Anderson, he's raising his hand.
A very quick one, and by all means sort of point me somewhere else, but I'm quite interested to know how you deal with the error rate in OCR, because OCR is not always cracked up to be, and especially when you get away from very clean digital text. And often the problem is that you're actually OCRing effectively a render of the text and not the text you're trying to extract. Do you have a process for that?
Gary, do you want to go first?
Yeah, well, I think that's an answer of two parts. There is a question about whether or not a transcription is accurate enough from the perspective of historical integrity. And I think that's sort of a line that has to be drawn by Peter. My barometer for that has been Dr. Dave Brown on the project, who is probably the most involved with Transcribus and is very, very happy with the results he's getting out of it. He's said he's getting 97% accuracy, 98% accuracy. And that's, for the most part, good enough. That's about as good as a human annotator, if not better. And he's able to go in and then fix any transcription errors for stuff that needs a little bit more treatment. But on that question of what do you do if it's atrocious, I don't think we've quite hit that yet, to be honest. And when it does happen, it's going to be a case of that probably won't make it into the database until it can be patched up in some way.
I can just add a little bit to that, which is in terms of OCR that you see on big newspaper databases where there's a lot of dirty text behind it. The handwritten text tool from Transcribus can also be put to work on printed materials, and particularly early printed materials. Its accuracy rate is much, much higher. So we've been putting, say, 19th, 18th century print materials through the handwritten text, and we're getting close to 100% accuracy. So that's very exciting. For the English language model, we have a huge corpus now of diplomatic editions, so done by historians, but the old-fashioned way, that is feeding the handwriting model. So it's also very strong and will continue to improve. And I think the key thing is not to present automated transcription as if it were a fully scholarly digital edition, as a digital humanist would present it, and having that distinction very clearly drawn in how you present materials is important so that the user can determine. We're not presenting the automatic transcriptions other than as a layer within the manuscript viewer, whereas we have this other standard TI XML for presenting digital editions on screen that are completely authoritative. So I think how you present the data and having real integrity over that is very important.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I mean, it just echoes some of the things that was brought up in Fred's presentation earlier. And one of the reasons for wanting to put a plain text thing is because at the moment, tools are doing OCR extraction on a render, and all the other stuff you don't want and hyphenation stuff all creeps in, and no one sees that. And yet we then go and do search that can break, or ligature characters go missing. And I was just sort of reflecting on that, but it's really interesting. It's nice to actually hear that to a certain extent things like Transcribus are doing a better job than an ordinary OCR of digitally native text. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Lovely talk too.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Brandon, we have a time for a very short question. I see your raised hand.
Sorry, one more question. Have you time?
Yeah, just 1 minute, and then we need to wrap up.
It's pretty much a question for Peter. Peter, I always love, and Gary as well, I always love hearing about this project and following along with us, and of an interest in the history and Irish history. What percentage of content is now sort of in the archive or being regenerated, and sort of are there timelines or current areas of focus or major milestones you're working towards?
Yes, the question about percentage of content would depend on knowing what the full content of the record office was in terms of words or documents and so on. So it's very hard to give an accurate percentage. There was quite a good visualization done of National Archives UK's materials recently, showing how you can visualize materials in different ways depending on, for instance, how intensively it's been catalogued versus the number of feet of shelf space it takes up. So to give you an example of the scale of our material as it is now, and we've still got another year to go before the centenary, there were 5,000 series of material in the record office in that catalogue that we put up. So there's 5,000 catalogue entries in our database for it, whereas we have over 50,000, I think it's 53,000 records of replacement materials that are interlinked with that catalogue. So now that's not to say that we have created 10 times more content than was in the original building, because that would be ludicrous, doesn't make sense. But we have expanded tenfold the knowledge that we had from 1919 over what we can interlink with that collection. So I think there's different ways that we have to learn to imagine what was lost and how much can be reconstructed, and it's very powerful. Our problem all the way through, and it's going to be the same into the future, is the scale of the content that we can bring into this connection. And the knowledge graph only opens that much further, because the knowledge graph can power collections that were outside the public record office, but because of bureaucratic connection, historical linkages are all completely associated with the same entities and people and problems and events that are referenced in them, and how we interlink all of that material will become very exciting to watch in the future. So that's a kind of a fluffy answer, but nonetheless, hopefully gives you an indication of the scale.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks,
Thank
Brandon.
you very. I think we need to wrap up now because we have only half an hour of break. Thank you again for being with us today and sharing with us your experience with Beyond 2022. So there is going to be a session, the first session of the day at 1:30. Session 1 on hate speech, and Brendan Phelan will chair that session. And now we have a break. Thank you again to be with us today. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.